Welcome back to the GTHL team preview show in preparation for the upcoming OHL draft. Thomas West alongside Liam Crothers. Today we're going to be talking about the Don Mills Flyers. Now, this is a team that certainly didn't finish exactly where they wanted to be in terms of the standings. They missed out on the playoffs by just a single game. It came down to a tiebreaker right at the end as they finished ninth. That being said, there's still some OHL talent on this team that's going to be in effect coming up in the draft. A team that should not be slept on.
No, and this is where scouts' jobs get difficult because these teams don't feature as high in the standings, and picking out those star players isn't as easy, which means that you're going to need to pay extra attention to some of the players that we're going to bring to you because they may be your late round steals.
Okay, let's take a look at some of those players right now. We'll look at the lines for Don Mills. This was a strong team in terms of forwards. They had a couple stalwarts on defense. Take us through these.
Yeah, and up on top, Kristian LAMANNA, Dylan Edwards, and Marko SAROGLOU, I thought were all effective forwards. And then if we move to the back end, we can see Luca MARRELLI and Chrisopher LI as the top defensive pair. Ben ZARETSKY behind them, I thought played well on defense. And then Jayden TANG between the pipes. I think he had a really, really strong season, and he showed off his ability facing a high volume of shots on a consistent basis.
So, Liam, when we look at those lines, there's quite a bit of talent there that we're looking at. But what exactly happened with this team where they weren't able to compete with some of those top teams and just ended up missing out on the playoffs?
I think a lot of it is from how top-heavy that team is. That first line was absolutely loaded with players that were all able to create goals, and maybe sometimes you question the coach's decision to have all of the talent in one place. Maybe if you disperse that talent amongst the lines, goals can be scored a little bit more effectively. You can get a couple of different looks, but when everything is on your first line, it feels like those guys get out there, they come back after a shift, and then you're waiting for them to get fresh before you can go out and score again, and that means that Jayden Tang's workload was always going to be heavy.
Let's take a look at the GTHL standings, which saw the Don Mills Flyers sitting in ninth place. Now, this was just outside a playoff spot, and they just weren't quite able to compete with those top teams. We flip things over to another look at the standings. This gives us a bit better gauge on how strong their schedule was and where they sit in the myhockeyrankings.com.
Yeah, and this can be based on strength of tournament schedule. We see Don Mills with just under a negative goal differential, and I think, again, that speaks to the way that they struggle to put the puck in the back of the net when some of those key players weren't on the ice. I mean, Edwards, SAROGLOU, LAMANNA are guys that we talked about having that ability, but, I mean, again, if they weren't on the ice, then the puck wasn't going to be able to find the back of the net.
So we've talked about some of these players, but we want to give you some projections for where we actually think these players are going to be sitting in terms of the OHL draft. So let's get into some of those right now. Your picks and where you think the players on the Don Mills Flyers go in the upcoming draft.
Round 1, I've got vacant here, but rounds 2 to 3, I've got Edwards, LAMANNA, and Marrelli. I think there's some talent there that some OHL team is going to be happy with. ZARETSKY, SAROGLOU, and Tang in 4 to 7. 8 to 12, PANACCI, Cummins, JESSOME, Moore, Lee, KROLICKI, and FRASER. A lot of names in 8 to 12, and I think that those are the diamonds in the rough. There are some guys there that are going to take a little bit more coaching, a little bit more development, but those players can turn into solid pieces. And then Keller, LEWIECKI, and TASSOPOULOS in 13 to 15. And what's important for this Don Mills Flyers team to remember is that even with a rough season that didn't go the way that they wanted to, it's always interesting to see where the contributions came from. And I think that what we've got there in the upper echelon in the rounds 2 to 3 and 4 to 7, those are some really key players that I think a lot of teams are going to overlook just simply because they're Don Mills Flyers players.
Yeah, so we've got a chance to watch a couple of these games, and although Don Mills wasn't the strongest team this year, there were some bright spots on this team. Obviously, Luca MARRELLI is a guy that comes to mind on the defensive side of things, a guy who wasn't necessarily on the top line, Ben ZARETSKY. He could have a place in the OHL as well.
Yeah, and in that defensive position, I thought ZARETSKY played well, and I'm interested to see what kind of impact he can make at the next level, because these are guys that maybe you spend a little bit more time on as an OHL scout or an OHL coach because you need to develop those skills, but the groundwork is already there. You know that the talent is possible. It's just about unlocking it.
Okay, so we both got to watch these games. We both have some projections. We'll throw it over for my projections as well. I'm a little bit more optimistic about round 1. Edwards and Marrelli, two guys I think that have the potential to go high up in that round. LAMANNA and SAROGLOU 2 to 3. And like you said before, there is some diamonds in the roughs down here. Some players that we'll talk about a little bit more. Lee, Tang, FRASER, and KROLICKI. They could go 4 to 7. TASSOPOULOS, ZARETSKY, GILL, JESSOME, PANACCI, Cummins, and more. These are some guys that I think are going to be a little bit later down in the draft. But like we said before, there are some good players on this team and some guys that an OHL team would certainly be happy with. And you mentioned the rest of the guys in the rounds 8 to 12 and a little bit higher than that. Even though this team didn't finish very high in the standings, and I think that that's something that may affect their draft stock, the fact that the team itself didn't do very well. But does that necessarily mean that these players are going to be going lower?
It can and it can't. It depends on the situation. Historically, we know that teams that finish higher up in the GTHL are more likely to have players drafted from those teams. But that just means that the players that are special are extra special for teams like Don Mills, because those are the players that get the most attention on these lower teams. And maybe you begin to question if taking a third line or a fourth line player from one of the top teams is the equivalent of taking a midliner from one of these teams, because I feel like a player on a team like Don Mills works harder. Is trying to play for more because they know that they don't have as much exposure, and there's always something on the line anytime they take the ice.
Okay, so that's some good coverage on what we have for the defenders and the forwards. It's time to flip things over to the goalie discussion right now. Jayden Tang spent a lot of the time between the pipes for the Don Mills Flyers, and he was good.
He was great. I mean, he had 3 shutouts during the 2018-19 season with Don Mills and been standing 5'10" at 195. He's not the biggest goaltender that we're going to see in the upcoming draft, but he uses his size effectively. He's got a great fundamental butterfly stance. He takes away so much of the net when he drops down with the pads. He can kick his legs out left to right. He stops a ton of shots that way. And I mean, the way that he follows the puck, it's really creative. You watch if a screen is put out in front of him, he's always getting down. He's trying to move his head around to spot where the puck is coming from. And as a goaltender, you have to be able to see the shot, because that's where your timing comes from, especially as a butterfly goalie. That's extra important. I think Tang does that very well.
Yeah, and what he did do very well was keep his team in games this year. This is a team that faced a lot of shots on goal. Jayden Tang, he did a lot of work right there between the pipes, and he was up to the task.
Yeah, and in a full game on our YouTube against the Junior Canadians, you're going to see Jayden Tang in between the pipes. He is the standout. I think more than half the highlights that we have listed are his, because he made so many big saves that kept the Don Mills Flyers in the game. It was his game to win, and he proved that he can rise to the occasion facing a big team like the Junior Canadians.
Yeah, a guy that definitely deserves to be looked at for the upcoming OHL draft. Some more guys that deserve to be looked at for the upcoming OHL draft that are not necessarily guys that are going to be going in the first round. We both have a pick. We'll start with mine. Jacob Keller was a player for the Don Mills Flyers that I think surprised a lot of people this year. He played very well, and it was surprising considering he started from Double-A. This was his first year jumping from just single A all the way up to Triple-A. And his progression right now is a very, very high curve. And I think if that continues, he could become an OHL talent in not too long. How impressive is it for a guy like Jacob Keller to skip over Double-A, come to Triple-A, and he certainly had a place on this team.
He did, and I think he took that place and he held on to it throughout the duration of the season, and that's always impressive because, you think about the jump that a player like that has to make from single to Triple-A. That's an entire level of development that you're missing out on, but he looked right at home.
Okay, and you have a pick as well for this. Who you got?
I do, and my pick here is Hudson Cummings, and as a centerman, he plays a very effective two-way game. He's rarely out of position. He's got a lot of value as maybe a second-line power play unit or on the first set of penalty killers, and he's really good in the face-off dot as well. That's a raw skill that a coach can work on as a kid develops in the OHL. There's always coaching to be had there, but when you have that initial skill set to build off of, that's already a massive building block that I think scouts are going to appreciate.
Yeah, that might be a little bit underrated, the ability to win face-offs. Something that's overlooked a little bit. How much value could that provide?
And as commentators, we do put a lot of stock in the winning face-offs, but it's important to start the possession with the puck, because if you can do that, you can set up plays, you can create, you can keep the puck out of your zone, and you can put the puck in the back of the net on the other side.
One of the most interesting thing I think for us while we're doing these shows is seeing how the teams change from year to year. So right now, obviously, we have been referencing the 2019-20 season. A lot can happen between seasons as we take a look at some of the players that are moving away from the team. Kristian LAMANNA, Dylan Edwards, Luca MARRELLI, Jayden Tang, and Christos TASSOPOULOS those are some big names leaving that team.
A lot of the names that you had mentioned off the top of the show that we had highlighted would have all been moving on from this Don Mills team. I'm not sure how they would have fared because there's a lot of talent that was on its way out the door. Interesting to see that 3 of the players we had listed on their way to the Mississauga Reps, so maybe those players trying to keep the connection between them that they had developed here at Don Mills.
Yeah, and that would be great to see because they played really well together this year for the Don Mills Flyers. They have to fill these holes. How are they going to do it?
And they're going to do that by adding some players from all around. We've got Dylan Bly coming in. We've got Capizzo from the Nationals, McLean from Barrie, Ethan Simpson, the right-handed catching goaltender from the Mississauga Sens, and Alejandro Bonafed coming in as well. I'm not sure that those gaps are filled to the same level that you would have been losing them with those players on their way out, but I guess we won't know as the season unfortunately was void. But it would have been interesting to see what kind of impact those players would have had and maybe if they would have been able to push Don Mills over that hump to get them into the playoffs.
And before we finish off this show as well, we wanted to share one story. Coach Anthony Holyoke had a great run with this team. And he had a really cool gesture right at the end of the year. If you're familiar with the Polar Express and this, being able to hear the silver bells, if you can hear the silver bells, you believe in Santa Claus. And Coach Anthony Holyoke did the same thing. He bought each player on his team a pair of silver bells and a round trip ticket to the Polar Express. And if you could hear the silver bells, you can believe that they could make it to the playoffs. And they came just oh so close to doing that. So a big ups there to Coach Holyoke for that gesture and a great thing to see in the GTHL. Well, we appreciate you tuning into this team preview show from Thomas West and Liam Crothers. We'll see you next time.